To the Institute of Politics and to Justice in 2024, a conversation with Vanita Gupta. Hello, my name is Jamie Selby. I'm a third-year law student and also went here for undergrad. Go Maroons! Throughout my time here at UChicago, I've been involved with the IOP as a volunteer for the New Americans program and as an events ambassador. I'm so excited to hear from Attorney Gupta as she talks about navigating justice in deeply polarized times, a topic that has certainly pervaded my legal studies and is a topic I'm sure everyone in the audience is very interested in as well. Vanita Gupta assumed the role of the 19th U.S. Associate Attorney General in 2021, becoming the third-ranking official at the Department of Justice. Throughout her tenure from 2021 to 2024, Attorney Gupta provided oversight to the department's civil litigating divisions. These divisions included civil, antitrust, civil rights, tax, environmental, and natural resources division, alongside managing the department's grant-making components. As a lifelong civil rights lawyer, Attorney Gupta has pursued her passion for social activism. Her efforts span from addressing the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision and highlighting its disproportionate impact on women and people of color, to instituting systemic investigations of police departments that violated the Constitution. Her career is a testament to her commitment to the pursuit of justice. In her capacity as Associate Attorney General, Attorney Gupta has been a leader on issues ranging from increasing support for victims of gun violence and other crimes to promoting competition and economic opportunity. Attorney Gupta today is joined by Evan Pérez, a senior justice correspondent at CNN. Mr. Pérez is based in Washington, D.C. and reports on legal, crime, and national security issues. A few housekeeping matters before we begin. Please take the time to turn off or silence your cell phones for the duration of the event. During the event, someone will be coming and placing a microphone in the audience. So when it's time for Q&A, please line up. And as usual, we give priority to the first questions to students. I also want to quickly highlight some upcoming speaker series. On May 2nd at 12:30, please join us at the IOP for a conversation with journalist Ariane Nettles and former IOP Pritzker Fellow Rhymefest, where they'll be discussing Black Chicago's influence on society and the world. And then on May 6th at 12 p.m., please join us for a talk on South Africa's energy crisis, featuring South African journalist Crystal Oderson, and this will also be at the IOP. For any more information, please visit the IOP's website, where you can find more on future speaker series and other opportunities at the IOP. And now please join me in welcoming Attorney Gupta and Mr. Pérez.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to listen to our conversation. I forgot to leave my phone back here. Joel, can I give this to you? Sorry. If there's any hot scoops, just take it down. I'll share a byline with you. Again, thank you for coming and for this is amazing weather in Chicago. I was not sure what we were going to get in April, but this is amazing. She told me to go for a run, which I did. So Vanita is now back in private life after working for the Justice Department for the last 3 years. And one of the complaints that people at the Justice Department, they voice it all the time, is that they think the media is not really paying attention to everything that they're doing, that there is one story, and I'll give you a couple of guesses as to which story that is dominating the news and taking attention from some of the important things that they are doing. And so, Vanita, since you just left, give me a sense of how you would sum up for people who may not have been paying attention, may not have heard about some of the things that you guys have been doing at the department. Let's start there with you describing, perhaps for folks here who may not be familiar with some of the work that has been going on.
Sure. Well, first, thank you all for choosing to come inside on this beautiful day. And I've had a 48-hour whirlwind here at the University of Chicago, spending time with students from every part of the campus, and they've been incredibly inspiring. But I'm really honored to be here this evening and with Evan in conversation. It is true, this is my second stint, or was my second stint at the Justice Department. I had previously headed the Civil Rights Division at the tail end of the Obama administration. And Evan and I have talked about this a little bit, but for you as a reporter and for me as a senior Justice Department leader, being in the Justice Department this go around was a pretty different experience. The country is in a different place, and the kind of focus of the public and the media on the Trump investigations and the special counsels has really dominated the airspace. If you look at the newspaper on any given day, that is just true. And it was like that almost from the very beginning of when I started. And yet the irony, of course, is that the same things that we were doing that generated front page news in the Civil Rights Division, whether it was the Ferguson Police Department report, which was actually the last time I was on stage here was to talk about that report, which dominated the news for weeks on end, right, and a lot of conversation about criminal justice reform and the like. These days, that type of thing either goes unnoticed or will get covered for a day or two and then kind of recede back, and the kind of focus on these other items will continue to dominate. I spent 3 years at the Justice Department in a very different role, where I was supervising 13 components, and as was just mentioned, all of the civil litigation, which is immense. Tens of thousands of lawyers are working across the country on civil litigation, but also all the grant making that we do. And we were dealing with some very significant issues. We came in to the department, obviously facing a morale crisis because of kind of experiences with the prior administration and what had happened to the Justice Department and the kind of valuation of the career decision making. But we were also dealing with a massive crisis in police community relations following the murder of George Floyd and the summer, mass protests all over, not just in the country, around the country, but around the world. And so dealing with a breakdown in police community trust, where there was an uptick in violent crime at the start, partly driven by the pandemic. It started in 2019 and in 2020 was made worse. And so we were working a lot on police reform. We opened pattern practice investigations into Louisville and Minneapolis. We re-energized all of the different tools that the Justice Department has to rebuild police community trust, and started collaborative reform and got very involved in de-escalation, crisis intervention training, and the like. We also had to deal with the Dobbs decision, where the Supreme Court, for the very first time in our nation's history, after expanding a right, took away a constitutional right. And so the Justice Department's work to protect access to reproductive health and freedom was a major challenge and has been a major challenge. We were dealing with the opioid crisis and fentanyl. We were, the list goes on, but the number, antitrust, suddenly kind of this burst. I will say, when I was in law school, nobody talked about antitrust work, but being here on campus for the last few days, it's amazing to me how many students have said that they're really interested in economic policy and antitrust work. And the challenges that we've brought against big tech, the Google challenge to the Google search engine, the Apple announcement that we just made. So there's just so much work that the Justice Department is doing on any given day, and happily we've been able to see reductions in violent crime, really significant, in some places now historic, but also a surge of gun violence. And I spent a lot of time, as you know, I spent time here in Chicago meeting with mothers who had lost kids to gun violence. We had to deal with any number of events of mass violence, including the horror of what happened in Uvalde, Texas. And so this is bread and butter work for the department, but we were using new tools and new tactics at a time, I think, when there's been kind of an erosion of trust in government and in institutions that I think is something that we took really seriously and wanted to show what the Justice Department is about, how we work, free from partisan influence. We, go where the facts and the law take us, and doing all of that work and the broad breadth of the ways in which the department touches the lives of everyday people around the country has been something that's been really important and sometimes lost.
So, we'll talk a little bit more about some of your experiences. There's so many things you touched on that I think deserve a fuller conversation, but we're going to pause for just a quick second because, there's things happening around the country, and I wanted to try to sort of address some of those things that I think we've all been observing just around the corner from here. Students have set up an encampment that is similar to some of the ones that you've seen at universities around the country. And obviously you've seen some of the developments at Columbia University with students going into taking over in a campus building and are refusing to come out. So, give me your thoughts on any concerns you have about where we are with this, and what should university administrators be doing and students should be doing to deal with this issue?
So Evan, of course, is starting with the softball questions. Nothing complicated about this bucket of questions. So this is an incredibly complex set of issues that campus administrators, student activists, police departments, campus police are contending with. I am a fervent believer as a lifelong civil rights lawyer and long time ago campus agitator myself in the importance of the freedom of expression and in ensuring that students are able to engage free speech, to complain about their government, to complain about or protest certain actions. That remains crucial, core to American democracy. I also think that there are rules of engagement around what is legal, what isn't, and when it comes to destroying property or engaging in criminal activity, I think that becomes a real problem. It undermines the message that students may be trying to put forth and the attention they may be trying to bring to very serious concerns like the grave humanitarian crisis in Gaza. I also think campus administrators are really having to balance the need to make sure that Jewish students and all students feel safe, free from harassment, free from threats, are feeling that their campus environment and their learning environment is welcoming of them, and that is an incredibly important issue. I think that, when you start to think about how do you police and manage mass demonstrations, this is an issue that is not new in this country, and there have been a lot of lessons learned, and even after the summer of 2020 when there were cities and jurisdictions that I don't think anyone was truly prepared for the scale of those protests around the country and for the duration. And so there have been lessons learned, and there were some jurisdictions that handled the protests and managed them such that people were able to express themselves peacefully and departments were able to keep people safe during the demonstrations. But there were jurisdictions that didn't, and there was a lot of litigation that we dealt with in the aftermath of that, kind of contesting some of those police actions. So, go ahead. Were you gonna say something?
I was gonna ask you. Obviously, we've seen different places handle this issue differently.
Yeah.
In Texas, we saw images, and in Atlanta, we saw images of police roughing up protesters. Also, university professors. In ways that seemed to be like harken back to what allegedly we were supposed to change after the George Floyd summer protests, that policing should have made some changes, right? And you don't see that in some of those videos. What do you think?
Well, look, I think the videos that are going to get attention are the places where there are, a lot of concerns around policing tactics, and we have seen those. I think people watched some of the videos about the Department of Public Safety in Texas and kind of had a lot of questions about whether those were appropriate policing tactics or not. I think that
they sure were a lot rougher than they were at Uvalde.
So there's, and I think that was a point that some of the parents in Uvalde made. But I think that there's been tremendous learning by law enforcement about how to both protect people's right to free expression and manage protests. And those are the places that may not be making the news. But look, these are really complicated decisions. I think campus administrators are figuring out, are they going to get involved in impeding a protest that may not be creating operational disturbance on the campus, and so they let them go? Are they going to deal with them through discipline, through the disciplinary system? Are they going to call the police? And what is the danger of doing that? And can it escalate and become a combustible situation? It's so context specific. And the students, right, they have to make decisions about what form of protest are they engaging? Are they smashing windows and defacing buildings? What messages are they putting out? What are their targets? Is their goal strategic? I think they're probably having a lot of those conversations as well.
We've seen some of the videos from some of the scenes, and you see people who appear to not be students, people who are associated with groups that we've seen before in other protests, and it appears that at least in some cases the outsiders are taking advantage of the situation and sort of hijacking what the students are trying to do.
Yeah, and I think students need to be vigilant about who is directing what it is that they're doing. Is it strategic or not? Or in the end, is it undermining the very thing that they're seeking to draw attention to? And look, it's a very volatile time right now, and it will, I know the convention's coming to Chicago. I'm expecting that the Chicago Police Department, the city, and other agencies are doing a lot of planning and preparation for. There's likely to be demonstrations around the convention. And what's happening in college campuses, I think there are real-time decisions getting made. The hope is that campuses are actually, thinking outside of an immediate crisis, how to prepare for these types of incidents on campus. And that there's a lot of thought about how can you de-escalate, how can you have engagement. There has been a lot of learning, I believe, in this country about managing mass demonstrations that both protect the First Amendment and keep people safe. But this is so context specific, and how this looks in different cities and campuses is going to be different everywhere. There's no one cookie cutter solution, which is part of the challenge here.
On another subject, just before we came out, the Justice Department put out a statement confirming some stories that have been published in various news organizations, by various news organizations, saying that the administration is taking the initiative or the initial steps to reclassify marijuana. This is something that I know you've written about, you've talked about in the past, about the classification of marijuana at a level that is essentially makes it on the same level as heroin. I assume you think this is the right move.
So I think that there's been such a long-standing conversation about marijuana and medicinal marijuana, and the states, frankly, have led the charge in many ways. But for those of you who aren't kind of following just the most immediate news, the Justice Department just confirmed that the Attorney General has recommended for rulemaking that would reclassify marijuana from a Schedule I drug. That really, the Schedule I drugs have no medicinal benefit. And so, as Evan just mentioned, heroin is in that category. And I believe maybe the only drug in that category, to Schedule III, which would make it at the level of ketamine and Tylenol, and where there are medicinal uses for it. It's going to be a long process, because rulemaking is a long process. I think I'm assuming that when the Justice Department kind of takes that look, and HHS has provided a lot of science to back up that kind of recommendation, that there is like a body of science that has persuaded the Attorney General to advocate to make that rule change. And again, I think states have been ahead in many ways on this issue, but it will be a long process. There'll be a whole opportunity for the public to comment, for medical communities to comment, for law enforcement to comment. So it'll be very interesting to see how all of this plays out. This is not a thing that...
Well, you're pro this decision.
I think if the science backs it up, I am definitely for following the science. Yeah, I mean, I've been an advocate. I've been very concerned about...
I'm trying to get her to say that she's pro-weed, but she's not doing it.
Evan, I've been very concerned about the selective enforcement of marijuana offenses in the states. I've been concerned about racially disparate marijuana enforcement, and I've spent my whole life on criminal justice reform. So I think that there has been a body of science that has emerged from
Right.
from so many years around marijuana policy.
All right, we're doing this, we're going to get this out of the way. There is another thing, obviously, we can't get through one of these without talking about the former president. And he has been very, very vocal. He's very upset that Matthew Colangelo, who is now one of the lead prosecutors in the case in New York that's being brought by the New York City District Attorney, the Manhattan District Attorney, alleging payments of hush money to a former porn star, that Matt Colangelo was sent there by the Justice Department to bring this case, evidence of collusion and so on. You worked with Colangelo. He was your deputy at the Justice Department. Is there anything, you can say about working with him? Is there anything that people should worry about because of where he came from, simply because he worked at DOJ before he went to the DA's office?
No. Matthew is, I won't even deign to credit the allegations that have been made, but Matthew is one of the finest lawyers I've ever worked with. He is a no-frills, he hates the limelight, he does his job, he's brilliant. He was my principal deputy for 2 years at the Justice Department and worked with me on all of the really complex civil litigation that we were managing, that the department was doing, as well as all the grant making to law enforcement and courts and justice reform. And everywhere he has ever worked, he has been an outstanding attorney. We started out as baby lawyers at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund together. But he went to New York after being away from his family. He would do this commute for 2 years away from his family in New York, and he joined the DA's office then, and he's just an excellent
You didn't
lawyer.
see him take a file of like
Evan,
stuff?
Evan.
All right, okay.
Who invited this guy?
I know, I'm sorry. He's probably never going to come back. Before we move on, I did want to bring up one other thing. Obviously, when you're the Associate Attorney General, we're going to talk a little bit more about that job, because it's such a, I don't think people understand how many different things you've got your hands in when you're in that job. But one of the things that is obviously very popular here apparently on this campus is antitrust. And so the department has been on a tear, definitely bringing cases, more cases than had been brought by the previous administration, which is not a surprise. There's been a lot of bad blood between Live Nation, the owners of Ticketmaster, and Taylor Swift fans. And every time there's a press conference at DOJ, I get emails, I get texts from people saying, is this it? Are they going to finally bring the antitrust case? And so, people want to know. And so I know that there's not much you can talk about if it's a pending matter, but what the hell's taking so long?
So no comment. I can't comment on
Why did things take
ongoing
so long?
investigations. I can say that I've been really proud that.
Did you like my bad blood?
Yes, I
Okay.
did. Did anyone catch that Swiftie reference?
Right.
I don't know how many people are Swifties in this audience. I was choosing to ignore it, but he has highlighted it. Very clever.
Okay.
The Attorney General, who is a Swiftie, will be very excited that you made mention. But look, the antitrust division there's been this renewed kind of appreciation for how much antitrust policy matters for many things that you do. When you purchase airline tickets, is there enough competition such that airline tickets are actually, the cost of them that competition is actually making it affordable for consumers, or the price of broiler chickens, or publishing. There was a great win that the Justice Department had trying to prevent the consolidation of the publishing market. And so these cases, and there's been a number of cases, as we talked about, against tech companies that are still pending and ongoing, and that are really challenging some of the intense, monopolies that some of these tech companies have on some of their products. So it is a time of a lot of vibrance in the antitrust work, these investigations. People are always complaining about how long any investigation takes, if the investigation exists. I can't confirm or deny. But it's, but look, you want, in any case that the department is doing, you want to make sure that you actually have the goods before you start prosecuting one of these cases. A lot of times in the antitrust world, these companies have the best lawyers and are paying a lot of money to law firms all over New York and DC and San Francisco, and so the Justice Department has to have an airtight case before they launch.
Again, people apparently love antitrust here, and the question I guess that arises is, the previous administration didn't bring many of these cases. This current administration has brought a lot more activity in this space, and so the question that people might have is, what is exactly different? I mean, the Justice Department had previously approved Live Nation's gobbling up of competitors, and it was viewed in a different light then. So, I'm just wondering whether this administration took a specific view of tightening enforcement in antitrust. Is that something that did happen?
Look, I mean, always in government, personnel is policy, and I think by putting Lena Khan in at the FTC and Jonathan Cantor in at the Justice Department, they had Tin Wu, they had in the White House, they put in people who were going to be aggressive about antitrust. But also, I think it's a mistake. Antitrust has a lot of bipartisan support, and a number of investigations that have been public in this administration were started by the previous administration or during the previous administration. So I think there's been a lot of momentum. There aren't that many bipartisan issues in Washington these days, as you may have noticed, but antitrust is one of them. And there really is this recognition or concern around, has big tech gotten too big? Like, what is the role of competition in our economic policy in helping consumers and creating fairness in the economic market? So I think that there was an intent by the administration to lean really far into making sure that we could ensure competition. And there's been changes. I mean, the law in some ways is very outdated in antitrust, and it's going to take time for these cases to change, and for Congress has been looking at bills around antitrust to see whether our antitrust laws can actually accommodate for the types of things that big tech is doing in our economy. So there's a lot of work happening, and then we're playing it out in real time. And I think that we're going to see where all of this ends up over the course of the next several years.
All right, so we're going to go back to talking about you and some of the work that you've done. We're in Chicago right now, where in talking to people who who've worked with you. One of the things that I heard from people outside the police community, for instance, I talked to Jim Pasco of the Fraternal Order of Police, and he is one of those people who came to have a respect for Vanita and her work with police reform, and that's a tough thing to get because there is generally a negative view in the policing community. They're not big supporters of the current administration. They don't love investigations of police departments. But one of the things he told me was that when you launched the Chicago Police Department investigation, that you were key in trying to get some of them to at least cooperate with what the police were doing. Tell me about that, and whether you think the department has improved since then.
Yeah, so, when the Justice Department, and you all may remember this if you were in Chicago at the time, it was after Laquan McDonald, and we opened our pattern of practice investigation into the Chicago Police Department. And it had just been on the heels of after we had opened an investigation into the Baltimore Police Department after Freddie Gray, and both cities had FOP police unions, and I had brought in the Baltimore FOP into the Civil Rights Division to have a conversation with me about what police officers were dealing with and confronting on the job. And I did the same thing on the eve of us opening the investigation into the Chicago PD. And I did that because it was clear that when there was a breakdown in a police department, such that we were seeing in Baltimore and Chicago with the community, there often was a very specific impact on police officers. Witnesses stopped talking to police, victims stopped sharing information because of this complete breakdown of trust. But also, in a place like Baltimore, the FOP, the police officers were telling me about how the 3 generations of mayors had basically pushed quota-based policing, and it had really endangered their relationship with the community to have this type of quota-based policing and needing to make a certain number of arrests in certain communities. And that was important information for the Justice Department to understand what was motivating or animating some of the police practices. And in Chicago, similarly, a lot of concern around arbitrary disciplinary systems, the lack of adequate supervision and training, the types of things that, you know, you may think, oh, only the community is bearing the brunt of, but actually police officers are also saying this is unfair. It's creating resentment, it's creating stress, it's creating, alienation from, and can create real harm then to communities when police officers are dealing with these types of issues. So getting inputs from police officers into these investigations is actually, to me, really, really important. And I think the department in this administration, early on, the Attorney General opened an investigation into the Minneapolis and Louisville police departments, and then has subsequently opened them up into several other departments as well, where there's been findings of, or allegations of pattern or practice of misconduct. This is important work, but in a nation of 18,000 police departments, when you open a dozen or so investigations and you have a dozen or to 2 dozen consent decrees around the country, that is not the only way that you improve policing culture and ensure constitutional policing.
Do you think that the Chicago police is in a better place now than that when that first pattern and practice?
So, I have not been as in the weeds about, and just so you all may have followed this, but one of the things that happened is right before the change of administration between Obama and Trump, we got the Baltimore consent decree filed with a federal judge, and we announced the findings in the Chicago Police Department. But it was going to be incumbent on the administration, the Justice Department in the Trump administration, to take those findings and negotiate with the city to get a consent decree. The Justice Department under Attorney General Sessions decided to back away and to pull out of negotiations from with the city of Chicago.
I was in the department that day when Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, came down to the press room and told us that the effort to investigate police was just not going to be a thing they were going to do anymore, and we knew Chicago was dead on arrival, and so that
right. And they had tried to get out of the Baltimore consent decree, and that was very ironic because the police commissioner and the mayor basically went to federal court and said, the city needs this consent decree. And the judge was like, I'm not dissolving this consent decree. This is with me now. But in Chicago, it was in a different posture. And so when the Justice Department pulled out, the findings report could have just stayed on a shelf. It was, a pretty damning report with a lot of findings. And what happened then was the Illinois State Attorney General Lisa Madigan picked it up. Illinois was one of then 2 states, I believe, that actually had a pattern of practice statute that allowed her to pick up the findings, use the Justice Department's findings to then negotiate a state consent decree with the Chicago Police Department. I only know kind of word of mouth. I think that there have been improvements, but it's slow going. These things are they often go in fits and starts. Leadership really matters. Focus by the city really matters. And it's going to take, these things never get resolved in 1 year. It takes persistent kind of focus and will. So my hope is that there's been significant improvement. I know there's still a lot of work to do.
Right. I mean, I think it's fair to say that whatever changes have been made, whatever improvements have been made, whatever has happened in those intervening years is going to be put to the test in August when the DNC, when the Democratic National Convention comes to town, and you hear so much from people in Washington about a concern of a repeat of 1968. I mean, literally the same things were happening then, right? Uprisings and protests on campuses, which rolled into a disastrous Chicago convention. I think everyone is trying to avoid that from happening.
Yeah, and look, I can't predict the future, look in the crystal ball, but I am optimistic that there have been lessons learned. I think, and even, Chicago had to learn some hard lessons in the summer of 2020, and I think there have been learnings, and I am sure that there's preparation happening now, and and not just because of the convention where there's an expectation, but even what's happening on campus and on campuses across the country. I know that organizations like the International Association of Chiefs of Police are gathering campus police and police departments around how to police mass demonstrations. I'm assuming the Justice Department will continue that work that we had done. We put out a whole report on best practices for that after the summer of 2020. So, look, there's been a lot of learning. It could be a volatile situation.
Are you concerned about that we are in a place with these protests on campuses that it could tip over and spiral into a different direction?
Sure, I'm always concerned that something like that could happen. I think that, again, I think context really matters, right? It's, in every campus, it's going to be playing out differently. It's playing out differently on GW campus, where the Metropolitan Police Department did not engage, even though the campus administrators asked them to. They said they don't believe that it requires a police response at this time, to what's happening in Columbia, which is a much more volatile situation right now. So I think it would be a mistake not to be concerned or to be vigilant about these dynamics. But again, look, it's both what's happening on campus, but I know that there are much broader foreign policy issues at play. We've got an election coming where we're also entering an election where we have had like an unprecedented number of threats to election administrators, to poll workers. That really concerns me too, this notion that the workers of our democracy, people who volunteer to serve as poll workers, are now, at risk of facing death threats for doing their basic job of ensuring election administration. And we have a capacity problem. We're going to need, the campaigns can do what they want, but there's always been a very robust, historically, effort to organize poll workers to be there on election day. And there's now a recruitment problem because people don't necessarily want to serve. And my hope is that all of us will be out there on election day, in a nonpartisan way, or you decide whether you want to do it for a campaign, but to help support the machinery of democracy, because that work and the protection of our democracy is not something that happens in the abstract. That is all of us doing what we can in our role to protect it.
One of the things that's been making the news, big news today, is the former president did an interview with Time Magazine in which he talked a little bit about reconfirming that if he were to win again, he would use the Justice Department in ways that people say should not be used. The current administration has taken a different tack, saying you can't use the Justice Department to do political things, or overtly political things, partisan political things, go after political enemies. As a former senior person there, what can you tell the average person, about, what can the institution do to protect those rights, or to protect their functioning from being affected by the change in direction in Washington?
Yeah, I think that the Attorney General has, from day one, made defending the rule of law and restoring the rule of law, restoring norms and practices at the Justice Department a priority. At the end of the day, people who want to come in to weaponize the department will try to do those things, but the department, fundamentally, the Department of Justice has a tiny fraction of political appointees. The vast majority of people who serve in the Justice Department are career civil servants who and who are career and are Department of Justice employees regardless of the administration. And they have a fair amount of power and discretion in their roles, and I am hopeful. The Justice Department has been through a lot of waves of political tides, and some of you may have seen, it's a little wonky, but this is in protection of the so-called deep state. Their Office of the Office of Management and Budget recently affirmed an OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, on a Schedule F. There was an effort in the prior administration to convert a lot of, I think, over 2.3 million positions to get them accepted out of civil service protection. And this administration changed that, and it required a lot of rulemaking. And sometimes what you're doing by trying to ensure civil service protections for government employees is to, through this rulemaking, and it throws sand in the gears and it makes it more difficult to undo. Certainly it could be undone.
I was going to say, and if he wins in November, those changes could go right back to the...
They could, but it takes a lot of time to do it. And so, I think that there are systems and mechanisms in place to try to avoid some of those extreme actions from taking place. But obviously, there's a lot at stake.
Elections have consequences.
And, yes.
Let's talk a little bit more about your history in civil rights. I mean, you came up outside of government, right? NAACP, ACLU, the Leadership Conference, and then you go inside the department where you're working on civil rights issues, back out. You are now back out again. How do you compare your experience, working inside the government and outside of the government? How does it differ?
It's so I've been asked this question a lot by students because I think it isn't as common as one might think to have senior government leaders who have been advocates on the outside at the institutions that I've been at. But the reality is, when I was doing civil rights litigation, and there was one case I had in the state of Texas, one of my first cases, where I was representing close to 36 wrongfully convicted individuals in a small town called Tulia, Texas. I was desperate to have the Justice Department in my cases because it means something to communities that may be the most dispossessed, the most vulnerable around the country, to have the United States government stand up and support and vindicate the rights of those in this country who may not have had access ever to the justice system. And so when I went in, I first went in as head of the Civil Rights Division, and the Civil Rights Division is the scrappy part. It's kind of the jewel of the Justice Department, Attorney General Eric Holder used to call it the crown jewel of the Justice Department. Part of its role is to push. Part of its role is to make sure the Justice Department has a lot of equities. We've got 4 law enforcement components: the FBI, DEA, ATF, and the U.S. Marshals. But we also have the Civil Rights Division, and we also are defending the rule of law. It's a very unique agency that has to wear all of these hats all at once. And the reality is that I always thought, and I thought this as an outside advocate, that you can't protect public safety if there is a systematic violation of people's civil rights, because people will not trust the police in the communities.
People won't accept.
They won't accept the police department as a legitimate operator in their communities. And so, to me, being able to be part of a Justice Department that really sees just how connected the protection of people's civil rights are with, police department legitimacy, but also having people believe that government, while highly imperfect, has a role to play in trying to make people's lives better. That's work that the Justice Department has done. So I have done this work on the outside. I think outside advocacy is crucial to holding government accountable. I met all the time with outside stakeholders, civil rights organizations, police leaders in this role to take in their comments about what the Justice Department was doing well, what we were doing wrong, getting their proposals. That's really important give and take for our democracy and for the health of our civil society. And then there's, levers that you have inside government to make change that can be incredibly powerful.
Which one is more fun, you think?
It takes the whole ecosystem, truly. It's, there are days where you're in government and you're like, wow, I thought I was in such a powerful position and yet I feel like I'm banging my head against the wall. And there are days when you're outside and you feel that way too. And, but I think when you understand how to make change and you can be strategic and you exercise good judgment.
When you're outside, you can tweet.
Yeah, well, you have to mind your P's and Q's when you're inside. That's true, because you're representing the United States government. You're not just speaking for yourself. But there are, incredible things you can do to make change, to make people's lives better on the inside. But often it is very much informed by the research and work that people are doing outside of government to help propel really good ideas and to try to get them to be actionable.
So in about 3 or 4 minutes, we'll be taking some questions from the audience. So, hopefully everybody has some great questions ready for you. Now that you've left the department, what do you think your role is going to be? Are you still going to be advocating for some of those things that you've spent all these years doing?
Yeah,
Tell us a little bit about what you're doing next.
Well, right now I'm over-parenting my 12 and 15-year-old and going to all of their games and being able to try to spend time with them without a second phone constantly in my face. And I'm taking a little bit of a break to recharge. But look, I've spent my whole life in public service and doing public interest work. I am one of a rare breed of very happy lawyers because even on the hardest days of whatever job I'm in, I don't have to question kind of whether I'm living a meaningful life. I can have hard days where I feel like I'm not making progress, but I don't have to question the why of what I'm doing.
Right.
And that's a huge privilege in many ways to be able to do that. I have a lot of concern about the state of our democracy, about rising inequality, about the polarization, about about disinformation, kind of creating greater polarization. I want to continue to work on these issues, whether it's in government or outside of government. And I think that there is so much work for all of us to do. You don't have to be at an advocacy organization or inside government to be able to want to have a more perfect union. We've got a lot of communities that are in pain now. We've got democratic things that we held as true for decades that are now at risk of being upended and overturned by courts. And I think that we are at an inflection point about what kind of country do we want to be. Right. Every election feels existential, and I just hope that we will be able to have a democratic process that truly allows every eligible voter who casts their vote to do that safely and to be able to have their vote counted, because these are some of the assumptions that I think have been put into question more recently.
Do you think if Joe Biden is reelected, do you anticipate perhaps serving in some role in a future second term if that happens?
Evan thinks that he's going to break news about, I have no idea whether I will go back into government, but I do firmly believe that I will continue to engage in public service. I consider, civil rights work and this work in government service to be patriotic work, the work of trying to perfect our union, even if it has been cast as partisan, or I've never seen this work as partisan. To me, this is about ensuring that the promise of our Constitution is actually made real for people in this country, and I think we still have a lot of work to do.
Before we go to questions, one more thing that I know you spent a lot of time on in the last few years is, some of the civil divisions work with people who were suing the department, bringing cases against the department for various things. The Nassar case, the failure by the Air Force to report that someone should not have been qualified for a background check to purchase a gun via the background check. There were a number of those cases that lingered over the number of years. Was there an effort on the part of this administration to resolve some of those more quickly? Is that what we're detecting?
Yeah, so I'll just say in closing, this is some of the work that I think gets under-recognized in the current media, but you know, some of what you do when you are a lawyer is you fight to the hilt and you do scorched earth litigation in court, and it can take years and years to vindicate rights, and the Justice Department did that in challenging the voter suppression laws in North Carolina and Texas in 2014, 2015, 2016. It took years and years to vindicate the Justice Department's positions in those cases. But some of what justice looks like is actually resolving cases. And when I came into the department, the Justice Department had been engaged in years-long litigation defending federal law enforcement. You named the Air Force, it was the FBI in Nassar, but there was the Parkland, right. The cases against that the Parkland victims and survivors had filed, the Sutherland Springs mass shooting in Texas, the Charleston AME church victims that right. had where Jim Comey at the FBI had actually acknowledged a problem in the background check of the perpetrator of that horrific crime. Other things like the family separation cases that we had inherited, the Nassar case, which now the settlement has just become public, involving the kind of abuse of gymnasts and athletes. And so we made choices to seek to resolve those cases and to support victims through those resolutions. And that was really important work that I think we had a choice to make. We could have continued with that litigation, or we could have tried to advance resolutions in those cases.
It seemed like those cases were happening a lot more than in previous years, and it does seem like it was a choice. We have time for questions, and there's a microphone back there. If anybody can make their way to be heard by the whole room, it'd be really good, so that everybody can hear what questions you guys have. And Vanita told me that she was eager, despite her protestations, she was eager to make news. So ask newsy questions. Help the cause.
Which prioritized students? So you just want to ask.
It's steamy up here.
It's the light.
Questions? Go ahead.
So I wanted to share a little of my disappointment about some of the discussions about the campus protests, including the one that you guys just had, and get your reaction.
Yeah.
So I think it seems very clear to me that people have the absolute right to protest what Israel is doing in Gaza and how the United States are supporting it. Now, I don't support it either, but and frankly, they should be supporting disobedience aspects of it as well. I mean, we have a tradition of civil disobedient protest, so a certain amount of disobedience probably needs to be supported as well. But what I'm struggling with is a lot of the protesting messages, or at least a significant number of them, are articulating really hateful messages. And it seems that people are reluctant to condemn those hateful messages. People are happy to say, oh, Jewish students should it's important for them to feel safe. That's different, and it's also different to sort of condemn anti-Semitism generally, because I think that's a pretty safe thing to do, but you don't see people condemning sort of specific hateful messages like we need more October 7ths, or we need intifadas, or messages like that. I'm wondering why you think that is, or if I'm misunderstanding it.
Well, I actually think that there have been campus administrators that have taken actions to expel students that have engaged in that type of hateful
I mean, I assume
speech.
those statements are like violations of student code of conduct, right?
And I think it is totally intolerable for those types of messages to be on campus. When I'm talking about students not feeling safe, that type of message probably, I mean, I haven't read all of the university codes that exist around the country, but I do know that there have been university administrators that have taken, very serious action against, and I think in some cases it's been contested who has been putting out those messages, but I don't see how those are tolerable at all on a university campus. And look, I think that there may be for some people for whom, that's a questionable call. I think for many folks that, I don't see how that's a questionable call.
Hi, my name is Hunter Adams. I met you the last time you were here, and I have a question that's less complex than that, and that is an epistemic justice question. You may know that the CDC, the American Psychiatric Association, the American Public Health Physicians Association have all said that racism is a public health crisis. And so Justice Leon Higginbottom, some years ago in his book, Shades of Color, in the appendix, he had 10 factors, what he called the 10 precepts of slavery inferiority jurisprudence. I bring that up because in a short piece of Chief Justice Taney's Dred Scott decision, he made the claim, of course without evidence, that Africans, black people, were beings of an inferior order.
So your question to...
I'm coming to that.
Okay.
So even though Speaker Pelosi took down the busts of Cheney in the House, still that statement still remains unchallenged. So my question is, how would you see, if it's possible, the Justice Department, or would it have to take a Supreme Court decision to rethink that language of the inherent inferiority of African people, black people, which speaks to the whole notion of racism as a public health crisis?
So I think I'm not totally, I want to make sure that I followed your question, but I think the department has, through the civil rights work, been very forceful and aggressive about enforcing civil rights violations all over the country on behalf of many marginalized and vulnerable groups. And so I am less worried that the department isn't speaking with moral clarity about where it stands in this administration about that type of language.
I appreciate everything that's been done, but this is more specific in that codified within the United States government is the notion, without evidence, that African people are beings of an inferior order. And I think that's something that underlies or undermines efforts to deal with racism as a public health crisis. So the question is, what could be done with that?
I mean, I think where that language exists or is codified, there has to be a move to change it. And I think you see that type of thing, even with, Confederate statues around the country coming down and people actually telling the actual history of what happened in this country. But I think where that language exists, that there are mechanisms to undo or to remove that type of language.
Thank you.
Yep.
I want to give an opportunity to students, any students in the room. Obviously this is a place for you guys to come and exchange ideas. You don't get people like Vanita to come visit very often, so I would love to hear from you.
I have a question for you on abortion, since you were a leader on that issue at DOJ. Now that you're out of it, did you feel like you were able to do enough? And was there any sense of frustration that, there were so many advocates asking that DOJ do more after Roe v. Wade was overturned? Did you feel like you had the power or like the support to do more? Or did you feel frustrated with what you were able to do?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It's so I was really, I don't think people had talked about Roe versus Wade getting overturned and the potential for that to happen with this court. It was really important that the Attorney General issued a very lengthy and immediate statement criticizing that decision and talking about the potential implications around the country and what we could expect after the Dobbs decision, much of which was borne out to be true. You know, it's interesting because at the Justice Department, like even at other strategic litigation shops, you know, you think about when it comes to affirmative litigation, where are you going to bring a case? What are the facts going to be? Because you have to be strategic about which courts you want to be in. You want to think about and be smart about where you're litigating. But we had a lot of advocates saying, you know, why aren't you filing in this state or that state? We just, as you may know, the Supreme Court just heard two major post-Dobbs cases, one about access to mifepristone, abortion medication, where the Justice Department was defending the FDA's longstanding scientific judgment in its approvals and regulations around mifepristone, which was being questioned in pretty unprecedented ways in this litigation. And then affirmative litigation, where that is now in one of, you know, pending before the Supreme Court, this question of what happens if a person shows up to an emergency room requiring abortion care to save her life, like, you know, in a state where there may be an abortion ban. What does that law, EMTALA, stand for?
Did you listen to the Supreme Court arguments?
I did.
In those? Okay.
And so,
what's your impression? What's
I am. I can say this now that I'm out, and I'm gonna answer your question, but I don't know. I'm a little less optimistic about the EMTALA case. I'm a little more optimistic about the access to mifepristone and defending the FDA's judgment, just because the alternative would truly undermine the whole regulatory scheme that undergirds the FDA's approvals and have much broader impact, which I think some of the justices, more conservative justices, actually care about. But there was limitations. There absolutely. I think litigation has limitations, right? And that is a major kind of tool for the Justice Department to be able to solve these issues. And what was interesting is, while litigation is crucially important, and these are landmark cases that are going to really have real impact on people, and whether, you know, women are going to be bleeding out in the parking lots outside of hospitals, unable to obtain care. But I also, so the litigation is important, but I was also watching these political answers where abortion was on the ballot and has been, it will be, and in every state where it's been on the ballot so far, voters have come out to preserve access to reproductive, health access and abortion, and that's not work that the department does. And yet there seems to be a huge movement. So I think I use that as an example to say there are limitations on the types of tools and tactics and levers that the department has. That said, when the department is speaking in the courts about what this federal law of the Emergency Medical Act, I can't remember what EMTALA stands for, but what that means something in the courts. Or when we are defending the FDA scientific judgment in defending their regulations of mifepristone, that means something. And so there's no question that it can be limiting, but thankfully there's an ecosystem, and this is where it gets to the importance of understanding that the department is not the only actor in any given space. There are a lot of people that are working locally, at the state level, at the federal level, and there's some are organizing, some are litigating, some are doing media work, and so there's a lot of different tools that you bring around any given problem. It can be the issue of reproductive freedom, it can be criminal justice reform, it can be election protection, voter protection. So I look at these problems as always requiring a kind of multifaceted approach in order to be able to problem solve.
We're going to try to get as many of these as possible. Sir, you were waiting a long time, so we're going to try to make it quick and we're going to answer and try to get as many quick as we can.
There are 18,000 police departments in the country. How does the department decide how to bring the relatively small number of pattern and practice cases?
Yeah. So very good modeling of a very succinct question. It is, the department is always, the Civil Rights Division is always gathering information. A lot of community leaders and activists will send letters about different problems. nonprofit organizations will do reports about problems in a police department. Folks here at the University of Chicago had supplied the department with a lot of information about CPD, for example. And so we're constantly kind of collecting and gathering. It is never triggered, a pattern practice investigation is never triggered by one single incident. It really has to be that there is an identification of systemic problems. And, but also, the department has a lot of other tools to reach many more departments, and that's through the funding, the training and technical assistance. The department's funding de-escalation training all over the country. They're funding crisis intervention training and alternatives to seek to promote alternatives for people who are having mental health crises or have substance use issues. So that's a way in which we actually do reach thousands of departments. The president signed an executive order on policing and criminal justice reform in May of 2022 that created an accreditation regime for police departments around the country. And that's gonna have, pretty sweeping change for police departments to adopt certain best practices. So that's the way in which the department actually can reach a very broad set of departments outside of just the pattern practice tool.
Next question.
I'm not sure how relevant this is, but I kind of wanted to understand how your role and responsibilities have been shaping with much technological advancements and more fake content being generated, and like, how do you keep yourself, like, how do you segregate these informations when you're like approaching some topic for the first time?
So, I think this is something that the department's grappling with. I think it's something that Congress and state legislatures are grappling with. You think about artificial intelligence, and I think that it is an open space that is demanding regulation and, frankly, expert understanding of the technology. And because it's moving so fast, the technology is way ahead of what any kind of legal regime that has been constructed around it. And so that is happening in real time right now. This thing around disinformation, I think, is a real challenge. There have been these robocalls placed that really seem very real. They're adapting people's voices and, or even in places images. And it's happening not just in the United States, it's happening in elections all over the country.
What do you think is the role, what's the role of the Justice Department or the federal government to decide whether those things are fake or
do they
have a role to say that?
They can investigate the companies that are putting out these types of disinformation feeds and that are assuming people's identities. But it is something that the department is really grappling with, is like, who is creating that content? And what are the tools that the department can use, to, whether it's prosecution or something else.
All right, we're gonna try to get these last two in.
Hello, my name's Alex Fuentes. I was at your seminar yesterday. I'm a first year at the college. I was wondering, out of all the cases that you litigated in the Justice Department, which one was your most difficult and why was it so difficult?
Gosh, that's a great question, except that it is very hard for me to pinpoint one of them.
That you can talk about.
Well, that is also a different issue. But look, I think by the time things came to my office, it was usually a problem that was very hard to resolve because, there were 13 components under me and hundreds and thousands of people that are working on different issues. And so it was, I can name some of them. I think inheriting the family separation cases was really challenging, and figuring out how to get to the right place on those.
The Uvalde investigation.
The Uvalde investigation actually proved to be really hard. It was not a hard call to get involved in that matter, but it took a long time to do the investigation. There were, dozens of police departments that deployed that day, and the families, made several trips down to Uvalde and meeting with the families. It was like both, I think, emotionally grueling, but also we needed to get every fact right because we would be criticized and our own credibility would be undermined. So it took a lot longer and a lot of intensive internal work to to get that out and then to kind of meet with the families. And we didn't have a prosecution that would, or an investigation in that case, but to be able to present them with answers that they deserved. I would say some of the, we had a lot of really complex cases involving where we inherited litigation and really had to figure out both how to have our lawyers retain credibility in court and not just do whiplash against changing positions while getting to just outcomes. And I can't go into as much details about those, but those were often the most complex cases that took a lot of time to figure out how to thread the needle and achieve kind of the goals that we had in those cases.
And saving the best for last, we have one more question. And
Try to build up, but well, no, this is actually not our first time meeting. This is about our fourth or fifth time meeting because you launched my career as an ACLU organizer at ACLU at Texas.
Oh, wow.
Yes, under your leadership at the Leadership Conference, I helped create the Office of Community Police Oversight in Dallas. And then when you were speaking here last time at the law school, we spoke about the consent decree. So my question is, as somebody who started as a student but has been about an 8 to 10 year activist for police accountability, who feels like we're kind of receding ground, especially on a local municipal level, do you have any just advice or tips or tricks on how we could kind of gain that ground back? I think I'm thinking specifically of the arbitration issue where now that police are allowed to go to arbitration, they can kind of undermine the newly formed Community Police Commission.
You're here in
Community Commission
Chicago.
for Public Safety and Accountability, that's the official name. But
And you're talking about it here in Chicago?
I'm talking about here in Chicago, but even if you don't have something applicable to Chicago, even just on a national level where we see that police accountability is in kind of a receding battle right now, especially when it comes to our Constitution, which you told me to always carry. You probably don't remember that.
Oh my gosh. Oh, wow. This is inspiring, and now I have to like leave you with something inspiring, which is, I think, important.
It could be morbid too, whatever.
No, look, I think that these issues, I don't think that police accountability is receding. I've actually been, we continue to have a lot of, events and incidents that are deeply troubling, but I also think that law enforcement is in a different place in this country. The vast majority of law enforcement is in a different place in this country. When Tyree Nichols was killed in Memphis, what was astonishing to me was the immediate kind of reaction of all the national law enforcement groups condemning what had happened to him. That was not something I had ever seen before. And I don't take that lightly because I think the kind of swift condemnation for how the officers behaved and what happened to this man was what I had not seen, and I think really reflected some culture change. Whether it always translates into action, I think that remains a big issue. It's not, we are continuing to have incidents that, like Tyree Nichols, that have plagued the country. But I also see such a change in how people have just assumed, we can assume that every police department today has de-escalation training or some version of it. In 2014, that was not the case. De-escalation was kind of a newer concept that a lot of police departments did not have that type of training. The George Floyd murder really pushed to the forefront what happens when police officers stand by and watch another police officer engage in such a violent act, and kind of the bystander accountability. These are the types of things that when you have criminal accountability or you have these high profile efforts that can help change culture. Are we where we need to be? No, but I have sensed a real sea change on several issues, and a lot of it is because folks like you are continuing to push and demand that your police department, both be accountable and have the trust of the community. And I think ultimately on all of these issues, we can't just sit back and expect things to happen that are going to make positive change in this country. It is up to us. Everything and all the progress we've ever made in this country has been because people have good people with good consciences have decided that this is what they're going to do to make their voices heard and to push for positive change. And if it's done strategically, it can really help make incredible progress. But that has only been as the result of people refusing to give in to despair and refusing to become cynical and really doing the work and rolling up your sleeves and doing the work wherever we find ourselves to make this country a more perfect union. So thank you for being the closing. This was so perfect, and I'm really grateful.
I want to thank all of you for coming out here on a beautiful day in Chicago. And of course, I want to thank you, Vanita, for the conversation, for taking all of my questions.
Thank you, Evan.
And for smirking when I made the Taylor Swift thing. The other thing I was going to mention, obviously in Charlotte the last couple of days, we saw this terrible incident with 4 police officers killed. So it's a reminder of, that the changes in policing is part of what you were working on, but also advocating and talking to the police and their concerns about their own safety.
And the real challenges of policing, and for their safety.
I watched this lady go into these meetings where these cops did not want to hear from her, did not like what she was about to say, but she walked in there, and as you can tell, she's very tall when she's wearing heels. But it's pretty impressive to watch people sort of have those conversations, even though they don't really want to have them. Thank you, Vanita, again, and thank you for having us here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.